fragments of Book XVIII. In all the time that men's deeds have been handed down by recorded history to the memory of posterity, the greatest war known to us is the Ys Marsic, so named after the Marsi. This war surpassed all that preceded it, both in the valorous exploits of its leaders and in the magnitude of its operations. The Trojan War, to be sure, and the merits of its heroes were so dramatically depicted by the most renowned of poets, Homer, that their glory is supreme. And since in that war Europe and Asia were locked in battle and the greatest continents were contending for victory, the exploits of the combatants were such that, for all succeeding generations, the dramatic stage has been filled with the tragic stories of their various ordeals. Nevertheless, those heroes were 10 years in subjugating the cities of the Troad, whereas the Romans of a later age conquered Antiochus the Great in a single engagement and emerged the masters of all Asia. After the Trojan War, the king of Persia led an army against Greece, and so vast a host accompanied him that even perennial streams were dried up. Yet the military genius of Themistocles and the valor of the Greeks brought down those Persians in defeat. At about the same time, the Carthaginians conducted an army of 300,000 men against Sicily. But by a single stratagem Gelon, the Syracusan commander, set fire in a moment to 200 ships, and cutting to pieces in pitched battle 150,000 of the enemy, took as many more captive. Nevertheless, the descendants of those who did these mighty deeds were defeated by the people who fought the Marsic War, the Romans. Next in order comes Alexander of Macedon, whose surpassing genius and courage enabled him to overthrow the Persian Empire. Yet, in more recent times, Roman arms took Macedonia itself captive. Carthage waged war with Rome over Sicily for 24 years, but after numerous mighty battles fought on land and sea was at last beaten back by the weight of Rome's military power. Soon after, however, Carthage set afoot the so-called Hannibalic War, and since her general was Hannibal, a man of the very highest ability, she was victorious on land and sea and won wide acclaim for her many achievements, only at the end to be brought down in defeat by the prowess of the Romans and Italians and the valor of Scipio, the Cimbri, giant-like in appearance and unexcelled in feats of strength, For though they had cut to pieces many large Roman armies and had 400,000 men poised for an attack on Italy, they were utterly cut to pieces by the valorous Romans. Since, therefore, on the basis of actual results, the palm for manly valor in war was awarded to the Romans and to the peoples who inhabit Italy, fortune, as if of set purpose, put these two at variance and set ablaze the war that surpassed all in magnitude. Indeed, when the nations of Italy revolted against Rome's domination, and those who from time immemorial had been accounted the bravest of men fell into discord and contention, the war that ensued reached the very summit of magnitude. And since the Marsi took the lead in the revolt, it was called the Marsic War. 2. Diodorus declares that the so-called Marsic War, which fell in his lifetime, was greater than any war in the past. He says that it was called Marsic after those who led the revolt, for certainly it was the united Italians who went to war against Rome. The primary cause of the war, he says, was this, that the Romans abandoned the disciplined, frugal, and stern manner of life that had brought them to such greatness, and fell into the pernicious pursuit of luxury and license. The plebs and senate being at odds as a result of this deterioration, the latter called on the Italians to support them, promising to admit them to the much coveted Roman citizenship and to confirm the grants by Laon. But when none of the promises made to the Italians was realized, war flared up between them and the Romans. This occurred when Lucius Marcius Philippus and Sextus Iulius I were consuls at Rome in the course of the 172nd Olympiad. In this conflict, all sorts and manner of sufferings, including the storming of cities, severally befell the two parties in the war, since victory tipped the scales in turn now this way, now that, as if of set purpose, and remained securely in the possession of neither, though after innumerable casualties on either side, it was belatedly and with difficulty brought about that Rome's power was firmly established. Engaged in the war with the Romans were the Samnites, the people of Asculum, the Lucanians, the Pisantines, the people of Nola, and other cities and nations. Their most notable and important city was Corfinium, recently established as federal capital of the Italians, and there they had set up, among other symbols of political and imperial might, a spacious forum and council hall, abundant store of money and other supplies of war, and a plentiful supply of food. They also set up a joint senate of 500 members, from whose number men worthy to rule the country and capable of providing for the common safety were to be selected for promotion. To them they entrusted the conduct of the war, giving the senators full power to act. The latter accordingly ordained that 2 consuls should be chosen annually and 12 praetors. The men installed as consuls were Quintus Pompedius Silo, a Martian by birth and first of his nation, and secondly, of Samnite blood, Gaius Aponius Mortillus, likewise a man of outstanding reputation and achievements in his nation. Dividing all Italy into 2 parts, they designated these as consular provinces and districts. To Pompedius they assigned the region from what is known as the Circola III to the Adriatic Sea, that is, the section to the northwest, and subordinated 6 praetors to him. The rest of Italy, to the southeast, they assigned to Gaius Mortillus, providing him likewise with 6 praetors. When they had so ably disposed their affairs, and had organized a government, which for the most part copied the time-honored Roman pattern, they devoted themselves henceforth to the energetic prosecution of the war, having given their federal city the new name Italia. Their struggle with the Romans went, for the most part, to their advantage up to the time when Gnaeus Pompeius was elected consul and took command of the war, and he, together with Sulla, legate under the other consul Cato, won notable victory, not once, but repeatedly, over the Italians, and shattered their cause to bits. Yet still they fought on. But after Gaius Cosconius was sent to take command in Iapygia, they were defeated again and again. Thereupon, reduced in strength, and left a mere remnant of their original numbers, by common consent they abandoned their federal capital, Corfinium, since the Marsi and all the neighbouring peoples had yielded to the Romans. They established themselves, however, at the Samnite town of Aesernia, and put themselves under 5 praetors, to one of whom, in particular, Quintus Pompedius Silo, they entrusted the supreme command because of his ability and reputation as a general. He, with the common consent of the praetors, built up a large army so that, including the men they already had, their numbers now totaled some 30,000. In addition, by freeing the slaves and, as occasion offered, providing them with arms, he assembled not far short of 20,000 men and 1,000 horsemen. Meeting in battle a Roman force under Mamercus, he slew a few Romans, but lost over 6,000 of his own men. At about the same time, Metellus too took by siege Venusia in Apulia, an important city with many soldiers, and took more than 3,000 captives. Since the Romans were increasingly gaining the upper hand, the Italians sent to King Mithridates of Pontus, whose military power and means were now at their height, asking him to bring an army into Italy against the Romans, for if they should join forces the might of Rome would easily be overthrown. Mithridates replied that he would lead his armies to Italy when he had brought Asia under his sway, for he was now occupied with this. In consequence, the rebels were downcast and in utter despair, for they had left to them only a few Samnites and Sabellians who were at Nola, and besides these, the remnants of the Lucanians under Lamponius and Clepetius. But now, since the Marsic War was virtually at an end, the intestine disputes that had earlier occurred in Rome took on new life, inasmuch as many prominent men were rival claimants for the command against Mithridates in view of the rich prizes it offered. Gaius Iulius R. and Gaius Marius, the man who had been 6 times consul, were pitted against one another, and the populace was divided in sentiment for one side or the other. Other disturbances occurred as well. The consul Sulla, however, quitted Rome and joined the armies gathered about Nola, and by striking fear into many of the neighbouring peoples forced them to surrender their persons and their cities. But once Sulla had set out for Asia to make war upon Mithridates, since Rome was now distracted by great disturbances and intestine bloodshed, Marcus Aponius and Tiberius Clepetius, and also Pompeius, the generals of the Italian remnant, who were now in Bruttium, laid siege for a long time to Aesia, a strongly fortified city. They did not succeed in capturing it, but leaving a part of their army to continue the siege, strongly invested Rhegium with the rest, expecting that if they once got it into their hands, they would at their ease transport their armies to Sicily and win control of the richest island under the sun. But Gaius Norbanus, the governor of Sicily, by prompt use of his large army and military resources, struck fear into the Italians by the magnitude of his preparations and rescued the people of Rhegium. Then, 82 PO. Or with the rekindling of the civil strife at Rome between Sulla and Marius, some fought for Sulla and some for Marius. Most of them perished in the conflict, and the survivors went over to the victorious Sulla. Thus, the flames of civil strife were quenched, and at the same time the greatest of wars, the Marsic, finally came to an end. 3. In days of old the Romans, by adhering to the 91 PO, best laws and customs, little by little became so powerful that they acquired the greatest and most splendid empire known to history. But in more recent times, when most nations had already been subjugated in war and there was a long period of peace, the ancient practices gave way at Rome to pernicious tendency. After the cessation of warfare, the young men turned to a soft and undisciplined manner of life, and their wealth served as purveyor to their desires. Throughout the city, lavishness was preferred to frugality, a life of ease to the practice of warlike pursuits, and he who was regarded as happy by the populace was not the man distinguished for his high qualities of character, but rather one who passed his whole life in the enjoyment of the most gratifying pleasures. Hence, elaborate and costly dinner parties came into fashion, with marvelously sweet-scented unguents, the use of expensive-colored draperies, and the making of dining couches with ivory, silver, and the other most expensive materials by workmen of rare skill. Of wines, any that gave but moderate pleasure to the palate were rejected, while Falernian, Chian, and all that rival these in flavour were consumed without stint, as were the fish and other choice foods that were most highly prized as delicacy. Following this standard, the young men would appear in the forum wearing garments of exceptional softness, and so sheer as to be transparent, quite like women's attire. And since they were busy acquiring the appurtenances of pleasure and of fatal ostentation, they soon raised the prices of these articles to incredible peaks. A jar of wine, for example, sold for 100 drachmas, a jar of Pontic smoked fish for 400 drachmas, chefs, who were especially gifted in the culinary arts, at 4 talents, and male concubines of striking physical beauty for many talents. Although the appetite for evil could not be corrected, some officials in the provinces attempted to remedy the craze for this kind of life, and to make their own conduct, placed as it was in the limelight by rank and position, a model of noble pursuits for all to imitate. Marcus Cato, a man distinguished for his probity and good conduct, when denouncing before the Senate the prevalence of luxury at Rome, stated that only in this city were jars of Pontic smoked fish valued more highly than teamsters, and catamites than farmlands. 4. I shall make mention of certain men to serve as models, both because they merit my praise and for the good it does to society, in order that the denunciations of history may lead the wicked to turn from their evil course, and the praises that its enduring glory confers may persuade the good to aspire to high standards of conduct. Quintus Scaevola applied very great energy to correcting by his personal integrity the perversion of men's ideal. When sent out to Asia as governor, he selected as his legate the noblest of his friends, Quintus Rutilius, and kept him at his side when taking counsel, issuing orders, and giving judgment about provincial matters. He resolved that all expenses for himself and his staff should come from his own purse. Furthermore, by his observance of frugality and simplicity, and by allowing nothing to warp his honesty, he enabled the province to recover from its former misery. Or his predecessors in Asia, being in partnership with the publicans, the very men who sat in judgment on public cases at Rome, had filled the province with their acts of lawlessness. Mucius Scaevola, by maintaining the administration of justice, incorruptible and exact, not only relieved the provincials from all legal chicanery, but in addition redressed the unjust exactions of the publicans. He assigned scrupulously fair tribunals to hear all who'd been wronged, and in every case found the publicans guilty. He forced them to reimburse the plaintiffs for financial losses they had suffered, while he required those who were accused of having put men to death to stand trial on capital charges. Indeed, in the case of the chief agent for the publicans, a slave who was ready to pay a great sum for his freedom and had already made an agreement with his masters, he acted promptly before the man was manumitted, and on his being found guilty had him crucified. This same man gave judgment against the publicans and handed them over to those whom they had wronged. So it came about that men who in their contempt for others and their desire for gain had a short while before often flouted the law were unexpectedly taken into custody by the men they had wronged and were led off to join the condemned. And since he furnished from his own purse the expenses normally provided for the governors and their staffs, he soon restored the goodwill of the allies towards Rome. 6. The governor's wisdom and virtue, together with the assistance he was enabled to render, served as a corrective to the hatred that had previously arisen against the ruling power. He himself was accorded quasi-divine honours among those he had benefited, and from his fellow citizens he received many tributes in recognition of his achievements. He was minded, but as some say, because in his will he had left the greater part of his property to the other son, he nearly lost everything. For the young man, rash and impetuous to excess, setting a diadem on his head and proclaiming himself king of the Macedonians, exhorted the populace to rise in revolt against Rome and restore the traditional kingdom once held by the Macedonians. Many flocked to his standard in anticipation of the looting that would take place. XVIII, however, in deep distress, sent someone to inform Sentius, the governor, of his son's mad folly. He sent also to Cotys, the king of the Thracians, asking him to summon the young man and persuade him to desist from his enterprise. Cotys, being on friendly terms with Euphanes, sent for him and, after detaining him for some days, handed him over to his father. He was acquitted of the charges placed against him. 7. We must speak also of the men who started from a quite humble level of repute, but set their sights on a goal no different from those mentioned. Indeed, the pursuit of virtue is found in equal measure among men of high rank and those of more lowly estate. 8. Lucius Acilius, son of a man who had risen only to the rank of quaestor, on being sent out as governor of Sicily, found the province ruined, but by the excellence of the measures he employed succeeded in restoring the island. Like Scaevola, he selected the finest of his friends as legate and adviser, a certain Gaius, surnamed Longus, an ardent partisan of the sober, old-fashioned way of life, and together with him a man named Publius, the most highly esteemed member of the equestrian order resident in Syracuse. The latter, indeed, was a man of exceptional personal qualities, quite apart from the gifts of fortune. His piety is attested by the sacrifices, the improvements made to temples and the dedications offered in his name, his sobriety by the fact that he retained his faculties unimpaired to his dying day, and his culture and humanity by the special consideration he showed to men of learning. In general, he was the benefactor of practitioners of any of the esteemed arts whom he assisted from his personal fortune without stint. These, then, were the two men on whom Silius relied, and having constructed adjoining houses to accommodate them, he kept them by him as he worked out the details of the administration of justice and devised means to further the rehabilitation of the province. This same man, aspiring to reform the administration of justice for the common good, banished sycophancy from the marketplace and made it his major concern to succor the weak. Whereas other governors had been wont to appoint guardians for orphan children and women without kinsmen, he designated himself as the one to care for them, and since he investigated for himself any disputes among them and took great care in making a decision, he rendered to all victims of oppression such assistance as was fitting. In general, he devoted his entire term of office to redressing private and public wrongs, and thereby restored the island to its former state of generally acclaimed prosperity. When the Senate was threatening Gracchus with war because of his transfer of the courts, he resolutely exclaimed, "Even though I perish, I shall not cease." The sword wrested from the grasp of the senators. This utterance, as though it had been some divine oracle, found fulfillment in accordance with the words spoken, inasmuch as Gracchus, having arrogated to himself tyrannical power, was put to death without trial. 10. Marcus Livius Drusus, though young in years, was endowed with every advantage. His father was a man of very great distinction, whose nobility and virtues had won him the particular affection of his fellow citizens. Drusus himself was the most competent orator of his generation, and was the wealthiest man in the city. He was highly trustworthy and most faithful to his promises. He was, moreover, imbued with a generous magnanimity. Hence, it was thought that he alone was destined to become the champion of the Senate. The family of the Drusi wielded very great influence because of the nobility of its members and the kindness and consideration that they displayed to their fellow citizens. Hence, when a certain law was brought forward and had just received approval, one citizen added the facetious amendment: "This law is binding on all citizens, except the two Drusi." When the Senate pronounced his legislation invalid, Drusus declared that the laws were within his sphere of competency and that he had the power, in his own person, to veto the senatorial decrees. This, however, he would not willingly do, since he knew full well that the offenders would in any case soon meet with the retribution they deserved. But if the laws drawn up by him were invalidated, so likewise, he claimed, would the law relating to the courts be null and void. And while, under this law, had it been put into effect, no one whose life had remained untainted by bribery would be liable to accusations, those who had plundered the provinces would be haled up to give an accounting before special courts for cases of bribery. Thus, the men who through jealousy were engaged in demolishing his reputation were in effect the assassins of their own decrees. 11. One swear by Jupiter Capitolinus, by Vesta of Rome, by Mars her ancestral god, by Sol the founder of the race, and by Terra the benefactress of animals and plants, likewise by the demigods who founded Rome and by the heroes who have contributed to increase her empire, that I will count the friend and foe of Drusus my friend and foe, and that I will spare neither property nor the lives of my children or parents, except as it be to the advantage of Drusus and of those who have taken this oath. If I become a citizen by the law of Drusus, I shall consider Rome my country and Drusus my greatest benefactor. This oath I will transmit to as many citizens as I can. If I swear faithfully, may all good things come to me. If I am forsworn, the reverse. 12. It so happened that a festival was being celebrated and that the theatre was filled with Romans who had turned out for the spectacle. When a comedian on the stage gave vent to his indignation, they, lynched him right in the theatre, declaring that he was not playing his part as the situation required. The festive occasion having thus been transformed into one of glowering hostility and utter panic, at this juncture Fortune introduced on the scene a droll, satyr-like figure. This was a certain Latin named Sonio, a buffoon with a wonderful gift for gaiety. Not only could he stir up laughter by what he said, but even without a word, his slightest motion would bring smiles to all who watched him, so winning was his natural appeal. In consequence, he was enthusiastically welcomed by the Romans in their theatres, but the Pisantines, wishing to deprive the Romans of this enjoyment and pleasure, had resolved to put him to death. Foreseeing what was about to happen, he came on the stage soon after the comedian had been killed and said, "Members of the audience, the omens are favourable. May the evil that has been done bring good fortune. Know that I am no Roman, but, subject to the fasces as you yourselves are, I traipse around Italy, peddling my graces in quest of merriment and laughter. Spare then the swallow that belongs to all men alike, to whom God has given the privilege of building her nest without risk in any man's house. It would be unfair for you to bring bitter tears upon yourselves." Continuing at length in a conciliatory and humorous vein, by the persuasive charm of his discourse, he wheedled them out of their bitter and vengeful mood, and thereby escaped the danger that threatened. The Marsic leader, Pompedius, embarked on a grandiose and fantastic venture. Assembling 10,000 men, drawn from the ranks of those who had occasion to fear judicial investigations, he led them on Rome with swords concealed beneath their garb of peace. It was his intention to surround the Senate with armed men and demand citizenship, or, if persuasion failed, to ravage the seat of empire with fire and sword. Encountering Gaius Domitius, who asked him, "Where are you going, Pompedius, with so large a band?" he said, "To Rome, to get citizenship at the summons of the tribunes." Domitius retorted that he would obtain the citizenship with less risk and more honourably if he approached the Senate in a manner which was not warlike. The Senate, he said, was in favour of granting this boon to the allies. If instead of violence, a petition was presented, Pompedius took the man's advice as in some way sacred, and persuaded by what he said, returned home. Thus, by his prudent words, Domitius rescued his country from grave danger, having proved far more effective in this interchange than the praetor Servilius in his dealings with the Pisantine. For the latter did not speak with them as to free men and allies, but treated them despitefully as slaves, and by his threats of fearful punishments spurred the allies to seek vengeance on him and the other Romans. Domitius, however, by speaking with moderation, converted the unthinking impulses of spirited rebels into a sentiment of goodwill. 14. They shared the booty with the soldiers, so that by getting a taste of the profits of war, the men who had experienced its perils would undertake the struggle for freedom with a willing heart. Marius led his army into Samnite territory and encamped over against the enemy. Pompedius, who had assumed full command of the Marsic forces, also advanced with his troops. As the armies came close to one another, their grim belligerency gave way to peaceful feeling. For as they reached the point where features could be distinguished, the soldiers on both sides detected many personal friends, refreshed their memory of not a few former comrades in arms, and identified numerous relatives and kinsmen, that is to say, men whom the law governing intermarriage had united in this kind of friendly tie. Since their common bonds compelled them to give voice to friendly greetings, they called one another by name and exchanged exhortations to abstain from murdering men bound to them by close ties. Laying aside their weapons, which had been placed in hostile poses of defense, they held out their hands in sign of friendly greeting. Seeing this, Marius himself advanced from the battle line, and when Pompedius had done the like, they conversed with one another like kinsmen. When the commanders had discussed at length the question of peace and the longed-for citizenship, in both armies a tide of joyous optimism surged up, and the whole encounter lost its warlike air and took on a festive appearance. And inasmuch as the soldiers, too, had in private conversations been urging peace, they were all glad to be relieved of the necessity of mutual slaughter. 16. There was at Asculum, where he had been remanded by the Romans for confinement, a certain Cilician named Agamemnon, who, through a sudden reverse in which his accomplices were cut down, had been taken alive. Having been released from prison by the Pisantines, he was now, in gratitude, cheerfully serving in their army. And since he had much experience in brigandage, he overran the enemy's country with a band of soldiers his equals in lawlessness. 17. Despite the lack either of distinguished ancestry or of any personal advantages that might lead to success, he unexpectedly arrived at the pinnacle of dignity and fame. Fortune is wont to veer towards what is morally fitting, and to involve those who have contrived some injustice against others in the same difficulties themselves. Perhaps for the present they exercise tyrannical power, but later they will have to render an accounting for their tyrannical crimes. 18. A Cretan came to the consul Julius with an offer of betrayal, and said, "If I enable you to conquer the enemy, what reward will you give me for my services?" The general said, "I will make you a Roman citizen, and you will be honored in my sight." Convulsed with laughter at this remark, the Cretan said, "In the eyes of the Cretan, citizenship is just high-sounding claptrap. Gain is what we aim at, and as we range over land and sea, every arrow we shoot is for ourselves and for the sake of money. So I too am here now to get money. Grant your reward of citizenship to the men who are now quarrelling over that very thing, and who are purchasing with blood this empty word for which men fight." The other laughed and said to him, "If our attempt is successful, I shall give you 1,000 drachmas. 19. The people of Arsania, pressed by starvation, employed a ruse of some sort to get the slaves out of the city. Indeed, their particular situation drove them to stop at nothing, and to procure their own safety even at the cost of destroying others. The slaves, however, on being plunged into a strange and dreadful predicament, withdrew and found a remedy for the brutality of their masters in the consideration shown them by the enemy. The people of Arsania, fed on dogs and other animals, for the compelling needs of nature, drove them to disregard all proprieties, and forced them to accept the uncouth food which they had previously spurned. Men's souls have in them some admixture of a divine nature, whereby on occasion they have forebodings of the future, and through certain natural means of calling up images foresee what is about to happen. This is precisely what happened to the women of Pinna, who bewailed in advance the calamity that was still in the future. The Italians brought all the children of Pinna before the city walls, and threatened to slaughter them if the city would not revolt from Rome. The men of Pinna, however, steeled themselves and replied that if deprived of their children, they should easily beget others, provided they were true to their alliance with Rome. The same Italians, despairing of resolving the situation by persuasion, perpetrated an act of surpassing cruelty. They brought the children up close to the walls and ordered them, as they were about to be killed, to beseech their fathers to take pity on the children they had begotten, and with hands raised towards heaven to invoke the Son, who watches over all human affairs, to save the lives of helpless young children. 20. The people of Pinner were caught in a dreadful dilemma. Since they had a hard and fast alliance with Rome, they were compelled to detach themselves from their natural emotions and stand idly by while their children were put to death before the eyes of those who had begotten them. 21. Their desperate courage throughout the struggle was such that it left posterity no hope of surpassing them in the endurance of horrors. And though the besiegers outnumbered them many times over, the townsmen made up for their deficiency in numbers by an excess of courage. The Italians, who so many times before had fought with distinction on behalf of Rome's empire, were now risking life and limb to secure their own, and their feats of bravery went far beyond those of their former victory. The Romans, on the other hand, being engaged in a struggle against their former subjects, considered it a disgrace to appear inferior to their inferior. 23. Lamponius rushed headlong at Crassus, for he believed that it was appropriate, not that the masses should fight on behalf of their leaders, but rather that the leaders should fight for the masses. 24. The Romans and the Italians contested which were to harvest the crops. In skirmishes and hand-to-hand fighting, the mutual slaughter continued without let-up. Since the ripe ears were there before them, ready to be reaped, they settled with their blood the question who was to have the essential food. No one waited on the urging of his commander. Nature itself, confronting them with the cold logic of deprivation, spurred them on to bravery. Each man stoutly faced the prospect of dying by the sword because he feared death by privation. 25. Sulla's conduct of affairs was effective and energetic, and he gained fame and a good reputation in Rome. The populace considered him worthy to be elected consul, and his name was on everyone's lips as a result of his courage and military skill. In short, it was quite evident that he was a man who would be elevated to some higher pinnacle of glory. Mithridates, having been victorious over the Roman command in Asia and having taken many prisoners, presented them all with clothes and supplies for travel and sent them back to their own lands. As the fame of this generous conduct was spread abroad, the cities were swept by an impulse to attach themselves to the king. Embassies were to be seen from all the cities, bearing decrees inviting him to their lands and hailing him as their God and Saviour. So too, wherever the king appeared, the cities poured forth bodily to meet him, their people clothed in festive garb and rejoicing greatly. 27. While Mithridates was gaining the ascendancy in Asia and the cities out of control were revolting from Rome, the Lesbians decided not only to align themselves with the king, but also to arrest Aquilius, who had sought refuge in Mytilene and was under medical treatment, and hand him over to Mithridates. They accordingly selected some of their most valiant young men and sent them to Bis lodging. They descended upon the place in a group, and seizing Aquilius, put him in fetters, thinking that he would be a magnificent and welcome gift for them to send to the king. He, however, though a very young man, had the courage to perform an heroic deed. Forestalling the men who were about to arrest him, he chose death in preference to elusage and a shameful execution. He slew himself, and by this frightful act so stunned his assailants that they had no heart to appear near him. With utter fearlessness, he departed this life with its approaching ills, and thereby gained widespread renown for his good courage. 28. In the fighting by sea the Rhodians enjoyed, in general, great superiority in everything but numbers. In the skill of their pilots, the marshalling of their ships, the experience of their oarsmen, the ability of their commanders, and the bravery of their marines. On the Cappadocian side, however, there was a lack of experience, a lack of training, and, the accessory cause of all troubles, a lack of discipline. In zeal, to be sure, they did not fall short of the Rhodians, inasmuch as the king was present in person to supervise and observe the fighting, and they were eager to demonstrate their loyalty to him. Since it was only in the number of their ships that they excelled, they swarmed about the enemy's ships and sought to encircle and cut them off. 29. Marius walked every day to the Campus Martius and engaged in military exercises, for he was concerned to correct the weakness and sluggishness of old age by daily and industrious participation in athletics. In his younger days, Gaius Marius, a man who attained the highest prominence, had aspired to noble achievements, and had rigorously avoided all avarice. And both in Libya and Europe he accomplished great deeds, whereby he won for himself far-famed distinction and renown. But in his extreme old age, seized with a desire to bring into his own hands the wealth of King Mithridates and the riches of the Asiatic cities, he suffered total ruin, for he brought disgrace on the high good fortune he had previously enjoyed, and in the attempt to wrest illegally from Cornelius Sulla the province assigned to him, brought down appropriate misfortune upon himself. And not only did he not obtain the wealth he coveted, but lost in addition what he already had, since, as a result of his excessive greed, all he possessed was confiscated. Condemned to death by his fatherland, he did indeed escape immediate execution, but only to wander alone and hunted about the country, and was finally driven out of Libya to seek refuge in Libyan Numidia, without attendance, without means, without friend. Later, when Rome became involved in civil disson 7 Pio, Scions, he assisted the enemies of his country, and not content merely to return home from exile, kindled the flames of war. And though he obtained a 7th consulship, he did not venture to tempt fortune further, his serious reverses having brought him to a realization of her fickle nature. Foreseeing that an attack upon Rome by Sulla was impending, he departed from life of his own volition. Yet since he left in his wake abundant seeds of war, he brought upon both his son and his fatherland the most dire calamities. The son, compelled to do battle against superior forces, perished miserably after seeking vain refuge in the underground tunnel. Rome and the cities of Italy plunged into the long impending conflict and suffered the disasters that stood ready and waiting for them. For example, the most outstanding men of Rome, Scaevola and Crassus R., were cruelly murdered without trial in the Senate House, and their private misfortunes provided a foretaste of the great woes that were to descend upon all Italy. Indeed, the majority of the senators and men of distinction were put to death by Sulla and his party, and in the course of the struggles and dissensions no fewer than 100,000 soldiers were slain. All this befell mankind because of the wealth that Marius had so coveted at the beginning. 30. Wealth, which is so great a source of contention to mankind, sometimes brings grievous misfortunes upon those who covet it. It prompts men to dark and lawless deeds, panders to every licentious pleasure, and guides the heedless into unworthy conduct. Accordingly, we see men of this sort involve themselves in great calamities, and also bring down disasters upon their cities. So great is wealth's power for evil when it is fondly esteemed above all else. Yet, in their excessive eagerness to possess it, men constantly recite these verses of the poets: "O gold, fairest gift received by mortals, such delights neither a mother, you, or again, let me be called a scoundrel, so I but gains." And the lyric verses: "Gold, offshoot of earth, what passion you kindle among mortals, mightiest of all, monarch of all. For men at war, your strength outstrips the strength of Ares. All things feel your spell. At Orpheus's song's trees followed in the witless race of beasts. You, however, draw after you the whole earth and sea and all-devising Ares. Yet how much better it would be to cull from the poet's lines that have just the opposite message. Lady Wisdom, be my delight. May the gods not bestow upon me, sooner than wisdom's self, tyranny or the bright gleam of golden riches. Farthest from Zeus stands he to whom fair treasure has come nigh.